a wise, ascended master whom students of the ascended masters will know on the instant, and who will soon become very familiar to all of you who are new to this new dispensation, once remarked that not knowing the true nature of God, it is impossible for students or mankind in general to understand the nature of man. For man, each and every son and daughter, man, woman, and child born into this world, with the divine spark upon the altar of their heart, are truly individualizations of God. However, if you seek to begin merely at the stage of that individualization, without at least some attempt to grasp the ground of being, the foundation upon which individualization is established and sustained eternally, you will be dealing with appearances, dealing with behaviors, and not fully having understanding and true knowledge. So, blessed children of Christianity, of the heritage of 2,000 years of Christianity, there are leaps, giant leaps in comprehension and developments in unveiling the true nature of the very highest level of God's presence. During the Mosaic epoch and dispensation, God was first a stern creator God, Jehovah, sending commandments from on high, and also in a way that was amazingly present and yet in some ways never really explained or accepted at face value, in addition to God referenced as the name Yad-He-Vav-He, or Jehovah. God was also Elohim. And astonishingly, Elohim is a plural noun, not a singular noun. That is why in the first chapters of Genesis, as God is speaking, God says, "Let us make man in our image," not "let me make man in my image and after my likeness." It is a plural. And that plural name of God, Elohim, is replete throughout the Old Testament in the Hebrew, having some counterpart to other Greek counterparts to that plural noun in the Greek of first century Palestine. Still, you all know the visage of that God in the Old Testament as Jehovah. primarily a deity who had singled out one patriarchal lineage and family and elevated them to a special case, a special relationship, not enjoyed by the rest of the mankind across the face of the earth. So this was almost, as it were, a national patron deity, which was not so unknown throughout the ancient world. When the next dispensation, the dispensation brought by beloved Jesus, came about, essentially God became a loving heavenly Father. A Father who was possessed of infinite compassion, forgiveness, and of course that great quality of abiding love and patience and tenderness. Admittedly, these are wonderful as far as they go, but they are proper names or designations that were overly simplified in one sense because of the need to have something that the common person could grasp hold of and make an association. God is like this. God is like that. God is similar to what you can hearken to in other analogies here in the outer world. There are advancements in the 21st century which have drawn aside the veil and have sought to delineate with far greater precision and transcendence more of the intrinsic nature of the highest levels of the Godhead, as much as that is possible. Other allusions to these advancements, the seeds of them were sown in certain elevated states of consciousness experienced by certain ones, which they then brought back and sought to memorialize by the nouns that they used to describe the nature of God when they experienced God at this highest level as the El Elyon, the Most High. As advancements in Christianity, we have progressed from understanding that where there was either a noun associated, the noun of one associated with the name of Jehovah or one God, that for most people, the implication that they took from this and the interpretations which the transcribers and interpreters from one language, ancient tongue, to another, over hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, was that when the adjective or noun one was juxtaposed and associated with the name of God, that it was only there as an inference to the idea that there is only a certain God. There is only one God, the one and only God of the Israelites of the ancient world, who was then transformed into the loving Father. But if you pay close attention to how Moses and others referenced that God, and Jesus himself referenced that God, the context in which they used this word one has far deeper meanings. And that's where, if you are ready to engage your 21st century heart and mind, you will begin a lifelong, earnest course of study and meditation and climbing in what we call attunement into the mystical experience of the presence of God. And as, when, and should you be so blessed as to enter into the fullness of that experience, you will know it for what it is as you are in it. You will bring back to your outer awareness what you can of the memory of what you experienced. And then it will be quite a challenge for you to conceptualize for yourself and memorialize and transfer the essence of that consciousness that you experienced in the presence of the Most High God in any form of language which others could relate to, and not come away with a mere blank stare upon their faces, either of indifference or because you have spoken what to them amounts to little more than gibberish, because you are attempting to describe the inscrutable. You are attempting to put into words that which is before and beyond words. That does not mean that advances have not been made, or that the effort is without its reward, because it most certainly is, with great reward. If you will permit us, then we will hearken back to the testimony that was delivered to Moses. Before Moses, in fact, it was delivered to Jacob on the occasion when he was given his new name of Israel, and woven by Jacob into the blessings, which he then laid hands upon his most beloved son, Joseph, which was yet one more lifetime preceding the lifetime of David, a lifetime, an incarnation of beloved Jesus. Let's take first the testimony delivered by Moses, which is basically the restating of that which God, in the person of the one who appeared to Moses, gave to him on the mountaintop, which he then memorialized and conveyed back to the children of Israel. Such then are the commandments, laws, and customs which Yahweh your God has instructed me to teach you, and for you to observe in the country to which you are on your way to possess. Hence, if throughout your lives you do have that fear of your God, and keep his laws and commandments, which I lay down for you today, you will live long, you and your child and grandchild. Therefore, listen, O Israel, keep and observe that which will make you to prosper and make you luminous, as Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, has promised you, in giving you the country flowing with milk and honey. Therefore, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one, the only Lord, the only Yahweh. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Tonight, these words are from the New Jerusalem interpretation of the Bible, and do use this phrase, listen, Israel, Yahweh our God is the one, the only Yahweh. So there is the reference to the fact that there is but this God, and there is also the prior noun that is used, codifying the concept of God as the one. Lest you think that this was perhaps sloppy penmanship, sloppy writing and composition, it's noteworthy to realize that Jesus himself quoted that very verse and elevated that injunction to the greatest of all of the commandments. This episode is recorded in the Gospel of Mark. One of the scribes who had listened to the debates appreciated that Jesus had given good answer and chose to put a further question to him. Quote, "Which is the first of all the commandments?" And Jesus replied, "This is the first. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second commandment is that you love your neighbor as yourself." And the scribe said to him, "Well spoken, Master. What you have said is true, that God is one, and there is no other." Now, of course, if you wish to, and I think that for the most part, Christianity heretofore has always taken this only in the context of the idea that there is but one legitimate deity and all others are imaginary. All others are idols. So there would be no need ever really to meditate or emphasize one, because it really is only another way of saying only. It's interesting to note that when the commandments were given to Moses, and here again, depending on whose interpretation you select, you will find this to be true or not. But in most, it reads that God said, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Meaning that the highest God should be held in the greatest worship and devotion and allegiance. It didn't say, "Okay, Israelites, we begin with the premise that all other deities, all other references to gods and goddesses, etc., all of the rest of these are false. And since they are all false, there is only myself as the one true God. That's not how it was said. What was said is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And of course, that is when it is understood that the one speaking is speaking as the personification or the messenger of this God, the one, that is to be the place of our highest allegiance. Also in those commandments, it says, thou shalt make no graven images of me, of this, the one. And you will see very shortly that that is absolutely the case, and it is the way in which this highest presence of God is to be known and interpreted. Here, necessarily, we are entering into what is going to be, for most Christians, new, uncharted territory. A few hundred years ago, cartographers had large swaths of Africa with no markings upon them at all, because it was all an unknown land. Similarly, before Lewis and Clark made their famous journey, the land to the westward of the eastern half up to the Mississippi, all of that was similarly uncharted. You will rejoice to know that there are those sons and daughters of God who have, both before their ascension and after, made the journey into El Elyon, God the Most High. They have gone into this inscrutable presence beyond everything else, and they have entered into the most intimate fusion of themselves with what they found there. And coming back, they invariably spoke about the all-encompassing, all-pervading, all-prevailing sense of God in that quality, if you wish to call it that, as one, the one, and the good. And this then is a very important jumping off point for so very much that is built upon that firmest of foundations. It's, of course, in one sense, very easy to start out here in this outer world of form and build up a scaffolding, build up a rationale like a Tower of Babel, and try to reach and assault the gates of God's presence from below. That way of approaching things is doomed to failure, because all you can do is observe phenomenon, observe behaviors in nature and so forth, for which there is no higher understanding, no higher reasonable explanation. On the other hand, if you forge an attunement and an understanding, such as it is, with the presence of God, as presence, as not merely oneness, but the one, not merely goodness, but the good, then you can and will find that everything after that unrolls and unfolds and expresses and pours forth based upon what came before it, and stays that way when it is correctly established, as long as it is suited to the presence of God, in some cases forever in eternity, in other cases as it suits God and the individualizations of God, as long as the purposes of that individualization are being achieved. And when they are fully achieved, and those outer expressions have served their purpose and the fruit has been garnered of those efforts, there is no waste or abandonment of the form, but the form itself is brought back where it came from in the beginning. So Moses and Jesus both hearkened back to, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one, the only God of very gods." Here is how Jacob, using under his new name of Israel, gave the blessing, which was passed on, if you might recall. First, God appeared to Abraham, making certain promises, establishing certain covenants with Abraham, and giving certain blessings to Abraham. Then the same God appeared to Abraham's beloved son Isaac and reiterated those covenants and blessings. When Isaac's son Jacob came of age and sojourned in a foreign land, God appeared to him and said, "I appeared to your grandfather Abraham, I appeared to your father Isaac, even as I am appearing to you now," and reiterating and passing along the lineage of these covenants and of these blessings. And here then is the ritual of where, just as Isaac passed along the blessings to Jacob, so too Jacob, or Israel in turn, passed them along to Joseph of the coat of many colors in the following blessing. Joseph is a fruitful bough planted by a spring, whose tendrils and vines have reached over the wall. Though the archers in their hostility have drawn their bows and attacked him, their bows have been broken by a mighty one. And in this translation, one is kept as a proper name for the Godhead. Broken by the mighty one. The sinews of their arms have been snapped by the power of, once again, the mighty one of Jacob, and by the name of the stone of Israel. The God of your father who assisted you, El Shaddai, who blesses you now with the blessings of the heavens above, the blessings of the deep below, the blessing of breast and womb, of grain and flour, of the everlasting hills, descend now upon Joseph's head, on the crown of the one, dedicated from amongst his brothers. So there, 4 times in that short passage, is this reference to God in his highest expression as the One. For most who have a Christian upbringing, be it Protestant or Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, or any one of numberless denominations and sects across the world, it is a glorious vision that has been set forth in this new dispensation in the 21st century of Christianity transcending itself, where the highest understanding of God is as the One, as that inscrutable presence that is everywhere behind the scenes, everywhere present, even though not apparent. A God who is everywhere supremely powerful, even though not always flexing that power. A God who in that oneness is everywhere perceptive and knowing. When Jesus wished to stress that quality of the all-knowing nature of the Godhead, he pointed out that not a sparrow falls that God does not know it. So all-knowing is God that the hairs of your head are numbered. God has that faculty because of this all-knowing omnipresence to be aware of all that is going on in life and in reality. This one that we spoke of, this wise one, goes by the name of beloved Saint Germain today. He was another Joseph, not Joseph, the son of Jacob of the coat of many colors, but Joseph, the guardian and protector of beloved Mother Mary, and the foster father of beloved Jesus as an infant and young son. We know him better today as the ascended master, Saint Germain. He has a long and illustrious career in this world. Many are the jeweled embodiments publicly chronicled in the Western world. He was, amongst others, Plato, and wrote about God the One, and God and in his aspect as the good, and gave the simple equation that the One is the good, that these two are the highest expressions of the Godhead. In these embodiments, he established a very important principle about the nature of God at this level, explaining that whenever you give a quality or an attribute to the One, as quickly as you say God is love or God is goodwill, by focusing on one attribute, you are neglecting all the others and giving a partial expression, a partial explanation. So in some respects, he explained that the best way to understand the nature of this God the One was to not add qualities, but understand that all of the divine qualities are subsumed They are all drawn up into their fountainhead, where they are no longer distinguishable. In fact, they are not, in that sense, any longer distinct. But they have all been subsumed into one supreme singularity. That is, the fountainhead source indeed, but not any one of the things that came forth from it. Unfortunately, in astrophysics, someone who didn't believe that stars could collapse into a pinpoint of concentration thought that by deriding them and calling them a black hole, he would invalidate the theory. So he gave it that negative connotation. But in one sense, the idea that hundreds of millions of suns, of the mass of many suns, could all be drawn together into one mathematical point, one dimensionless point of virtually limitless mass, testified to by the attractive force of that. Now, in that one point, you no longer have hydrogen, helium, although maybe some of those elements were drawn into it. You no longer even have protons or neutrons or electrons. You have an in-breath that is all of these in what can only be described as a singularity where the laws of time and space themselves have collapsed and no longer pertain to what is going on there. So Saint Germain's approach in that sense was kind of like a sculptor who begins with a cube of marble and establishes a figure, such as a wonderful, beautiful face, not by drawing upon the marble a two-dimensional image, but by chipping away at the marble and removing the excess and allowing the truth of the figure to emerge by what is left. So his approach, as Plato and again as Proclus, was mainly to say God is above every other quality. God is not specific qualities. And yet it was not ever to imply that once you approached this level, you had arrived at an absolute non-entity that was a void. Far, far from it. You had arrived at the level of the Godhead that was simply and primevally in its original estate of absolute and tranquil and unassailable oneness as a presence, the brooding presence of God that moved upon the waters and issued forth the let there be commands. Let there be light, etc., etc. For those stalwart ones who can accept the testimony of those who have gone to this mountaintop and returned, and you find that there is a path that has been left by them for you to follow, you may approach this august presence. And by the way, you will discover that therein lies the root of your own individuality and your own selfhood. That, as we will develop in the forthcoming days, Although this is that inscrutable presence, it has a number of qualities that can be attributed to it based upon the evidence of all of the things that come forth out of that inscrutable presence of the One and the good. So, another disciple of Plato had a little bit more optimistic, or at least thought it worthwhile to make the effort to teach the unteachable, to describe the indescribable, to encourage all to make the ascent for themselves, and to testify to the bliss that is to be experienced upon arriving at that Everest of the pinnacle of God awareness as the One and the good. So this disciple chose to describe in a way of saying you can think of it like this. Think of it in this way, as if. And in that way avoided the mistake of trying to put a subset or a limitation upon that presence, while yet giving signposts along the way to that presence as guide markers for those who would make the ascent. So now we are going to talk about some of those expressions of the presence of God as the One. First of all, it is most clearly a presence that is known and experienced and detected. A presence that truly is everywhere present. It is a great brooding presence of the Godhead that exhibits a radiation of identifying with every part of life, and also in an utter givingness of its own untrammeled nature to every single part of life, not only to sentient beings such as human beings or lesser deities, but to every part of inorganic life as well. Every part of reality participates in the givingness of this one presence. One of the other attributes of this one is that it has a oneness about it. That is not a word play. What is meant is that because the presence is one, it will not suffer to be divided from itself. It will not countenance duality. And this we observe as a quality of coherence to itself. In chemistry, there is adhesion, which is when one type of material wants to cling to a different type of material. In addition to adhesion, there is what is known as cohesion. And that is when one type of material wants to stick to other particles of the same type of material. As I understand it, if you have astronauts that go out into the weightlessness of outer space, and they happen to spill a glass of water into the weightlessness of space, if that water is allowed to be undisturbed, it will arrange itself so as to cohere to itself and get all the particles, the H2O molecules will try to crowd in and to approach as closely to one another as they can. In doing so, the geometric form that they inevitably, consistently fashion is a sphere, a globule of water, because they are cohering to themselves, if you will. That is a very poor and rough and only partial analogy, but it does relate to the fact that this one presence is internally related to itself and is its supreme attribute, that from which all other attributes flow, is that oneness that will not countenance to be chopped in two, or chopped in three, or chopped into 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000, or any number of bifurcated fragments. God is forever one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. So if you can imagine that for a moment, this one is internally related to its very own self, its very own oneness. All the while it is without constituent parts. At this level, there are not yet particles of oneness. There is only one. And that is the supreme quality. And that is the nature of the Godhead. That God is one. And the important thing to remember is that for there to be anything else that is a something, it must have a part or a share in the oneness of the one. If anything, at any level, ever is totally cut off from participating in oneness, that goes into total non-existence and dissolution. A house divided against itself cannot stand. So a house has an internal unity that makes it an assemblage of many parts that are made one, so that it is not divided against itself. There are numberless examples that you could consider. An army is only an army if it is unified, if it is one. A choir is only a choir if all of the singers are one and work in unison and harmony with each other. Your body is held together as an integrated vehicle of your expression because all of the individual lives of the cells are caused to be knit into one. When that part of your soul and breath, which makes them one, when that leaves the body, the individual cells are still alive, but everybody's on their own. Every cell is on its own. And so they go their separate ways, and you no longer have a body. So, down to the most outward form and life and so forth, there are always golden threads of oneness that can be traced back to the presence, where the presence of the one shares its quality of oneness and has thereby unrolled all of creation. The force that the one uses is the force that is known as love. But love itself is oneness. It is mutuality. It is a coming into union, a communion of like-minded and kindred spirits and hearts who give and receive each other's portion of the presence, one with the other. And that giving and receiving is what we call love. This God, the One, is truly the supreme fountainhead from which all of the rest of reality stems. It is, if you will, a source that needs no source but itself. It is the source to every other part of life. Before there is life, there is the One. The One is the source of what we consider life or vitality or prana. Before there is being or existence, there is the source of being and existence, and that is the One. Before there is an individual mind that is capable of introspective thought, there is the source of mind, the source of thought. And that, again, is the One. The One is, if you will, overflowing with its own oneness and its own goodness. It is supra-full. It is a fullness that is more than adequate to itself, that overflows and forever pours forth out of itself the givingness of itself to every other part of reality. And astonishingly and mysteriously, it is nonetheless true that as much as it pours forth, it is never one whit depleted or diminished by that which pours forth from it. That might be for you a brand new possibility or prospect, and it might take you decades to realize what that means or the truth of it or the implications of it, but it is nonetheless true that the One never stops being the One and the good for all that flows forth from it. All that goes forth out of it rolls and unrolls into worlds upon worlds, dimensions upon dimensions, and eventually circles round about and comes back again and returns back into that sourceless source of the One and the good. This presence, then, due to that oneness and cohesiveness of its own internal relationship to itself, is simultaneously itself by itself and therefore untouched and unmoved by anything that flows forth from it. And while it remains that way, because of that very thing, it is able to be the wellspring, the fountainhead, the sourceless source, the supra-fullness that pours forth with a power that defies quantification. It pours forth and eventually accounts, after many stepping down of its intensity, finally emerges in what we see as the observable three-dimensional universe. Now, this presence is not a blank. It is not dumb and insensate. It is an awareness, a conscious awareness. The best symbol that will ever be conceived of, at least at the level of the unascended mankind of earth, the best symbol is one that is not unique to the mystery schools, but has been appropriated, correctly so, by Christian churches and Christian denominations far and wide across the face of the earth. It is the consciousness of a triangle within which is enshrined one eye. And this eye is open. This eye is unblinking. This eye and the triangle around it are surrounded by a limitless radiance that goes forth from it. And the intent of that symbol is to capture the awakened state, the absolute awareness that is within the one. So when you interact with that presence or you rise into that level, you don't either go to sleep or cease for all of that to exist and have a blankness of annihilation. Instead, you have a transcendent, absolute awareness, which is prior to thought. There's no need for thinking at that level. There's hardly a need for cognizing, but there is a conscious awareness. And coupled with that awareness, of course, is that cohesive sense of self, oneness, and cohesion. So there is the foreshadowing of the introspective focus of this presence upon itself. It's going to be quite a while before we ever detect time as we know it. Quite a while before we ever detect space as we know it. A lot will happen between this highest level of Elyon, of the one, the mighty one of Israel, and the natural world that we observe out here. So at this highest level, there is this absolute consciousness. One of the other qualities about this is that it is absolutely, positively not personal. I think of a humorous example. It would be laughable if it weren't so serious. But in a lot of the movies about the mafia, when one mob guy is going to kill another, he says, "It's not personal, it's just business. It's nothing personal." This one is more than universal, but certainly more than what you would consider to be normally personal in that sense. It is absolutely what it is. And in all eternity, it will never not be the oneness and the goodness that it is. And nothing is ever going to tug at the heartstrings of that oneness in a way that's going to cause it to change what it is at that level. And that is why there is the reference to law, because this one is law. its law of its nature, the law of its being, is its own intrinsic nature, and it cannot be other than that which it is. And it is impersonal, which doesn't mean cold-hearted, unfeeling, uncaring. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean that it acts the same way all the time and is what it is. I am that I am. It is that nature. And so that aspect of itself in that sense is what translates and becomes at lower levels what we observe as cosmic law. Law that is no respecter of any person, good, bad, or indifferent, favorite sons or daughters. It's the impersonality that we see around us in the natural world. The weather doesn't care. Landslides don't care. Asteroids don't care if they hurtle towards the earth. Those are all part of the necessity of cosmic law, and actually a few other dubious human qualities that have produced the negative connotations of those. But nonetheless, it is absolutely universal. Uni is for one. There's a whole list of words that stem from this one. Universal is the whole universe based on the one. Uniform is based upon the one. It means consistent. If you wear a uniform, your team members all wear the same uniform. Unity. The list goes on, and they all have their grounding in the one, which is in that way one. Quite frankly, this should be the faith of every scientist. They should really be drawn to this understanding of God. For this is where the God as a theological deity and the laws of nature come together and are subsumed into the one. And it is because nature is one that there are these constants, such as the force of gravity, the force of electromagnetism, all of those formulas that behave identically on this side of the universe and on the far side of the universe, behave identically in earlier epochs and in later epochs. They all behave the same way because they all are grounded in and are expressions of the one. Mathematics itself is a facet of the nature of the one. The consistency of principles in mathematics are really born out of the presence of God as the one. The singularity of singularities. There is a constancy, a consistency, a universality, and dare we say, it is a faith that is grounded in, and here we have to be careful that you don't misapply the meaning of words that you have used all your life and give them archaic interpretations. But there is in this presence the source of what becomes logic, the source of what becomes reason or rational thinking and intuition, the source of what is the objects of knowledge. All of these tumble forth forever, spilling out of the supra-fullness that is the one and the good. So in this sense, this is the presence of God that is absolutely the presence behind every single part of life in ways that would be difficult to go into or explain really. You can't imagine that at that level of God as the one and the good, that there are constituent parts or particles or subsets. As soon as you have parts, you have movement, and you have levels of reality and levels of the Godhead's future expression at lower levels, certainly. But at this highest level, there is an utter self-sufficient simplicity. Not simple-mindedness, but purity and simplicity. An absolute, unperturbable tranquility and supreme confidence of unassailability, and a supreme sense of self-sufficiency. You know, the human race since the fall of man has been deficient. The human race has had to depend upon fire that's outside of itself for warmth, light outside of itself for light to see by, plant life and animal life for nutrition. In almost every way, human beings are needy, and they have developed an ingrained habit of thinking that way, that they must be almost living off of other parts of God's creation and deriving what they need out of those other parts. This is so ingrained that it, from the cradle to the grave, most people never realize that they are constantly casting about for things outside themselves to prop themselves up, to fill the emptiness that's there, to meet their needs. God, this presence, is not so. God is whole. God is the source of every fullness of life. And so supremely so that this presence is able to give and give and give without ever being the slightest depleted. That is something that God is also able to convey to the constituent expressions of that presence of God. So that presence is supremely self-sufficient to the nth degree. Not having any neediness in itself, that presence is able to express as the good, bountifully giving and bestowing what it is, what it has of its own intrinsic nature, giving it forth freely, and as the saying goes, without condition, to every other part of life. And I might add that unconditional love is not limited to loving your enemies or your friends. It's not limited to loving people. The love of this presence that goes forth, which is the flow of the good of God going forth as love, that goes forth and loves every part of nature unconditionally. Inorganic life as much as organic life. Life that is in its infancy of waking up as much as life such as you have. And you may look forward in the example set before you by those ascended ones who stand upon this altar and give of themselves out of the fullness that they are, the sufficiency that they are, give of themselves to you. That already is an attribute of what you know as your own God self or God presence. It's a little challenging to hold back the reins tonight and not get ahead of ourselves and go into the next phase of how this presence of God, through its cohesiveness, through its self-relatedness to itself as its oneness, and its awareness and consciousness of itself, of how that presence, without ever leaving the seat of its own unparticipated being itself, being the I am, that I am, how that presence says to itself, let us make offspring after our own image and after our likeness. That is what we will get into, and in it there is this mystery of this formula of identity, of your identity, of your God self, which is hands down the greatest advancement to come to Christianity. We say in the 21st century, but this particular advancement was punctuated in the 20th century. And it is a formula where this mighty one is referred to as a mighty presence. And the formula is God is presence, and God is the focus of that presence as I, and God is the allness of that presence as am. So the individualizations of God are a one that is presence, that is I, that is am, and that is presence. And there is so very much that is encapsulated in that simple compound proper name. Threefold as I and am as presence, with an adjective of mighty or almighty before it. That is part of the story that we will develop in the days ahead. Tonight, by design, we have specifically focused on the aspect of this presence in its oneness. And we've barely scratched the surface. In addition, however, to being the one, this presence is also the good. And the good is another mode of saying the same thing. In fact, it is a little bit more relatable than the one. The one, because it is so doggone impersonal and absolutely that which it is, unmoved, unmovable, the rock upon which everything else is built. Still, for all of that, this one is the supreme, benevolent Spirit of God, that in its lavishness, it is a state of pristine and absolute, unstainable purity and perfection. And because it is so supremely perfect, it can't help but spill out that perfection which it is and radiate that perfection forth into every single part of life. And you, and you, and you, and every heart flame, every little lamb of God born into this world is a princeling or a princess, a royal child that is the tip of the lance of an expression of this, the one presence. Once again, giving of itself in a never-ending multiplication, in a never-ending revelry, a never-ending cosmic bliss of rejoicing and dancing in the fierce, boiling life of the presence of God that can't help but give of itself to the other parts of itself, to want to enrich in every other part of life and every other part of itself, to lavish the best upon it, to plan the best, and to continue to unfold. It unfolds and it unfolds and it unfolds and pours forth and refines and develops the many aspects of its absolute one. And through a marvelous process is forever seeking to make life still better yet, make life richer, make life more beautiful, make life more joyous and happy. God has ambitious plans and is forever conceiving limitless ideas of how to make your experience the very best possible. And what could be better than that you yourself should be, not that God should give himself to you, because that assumes the false premise that somehow there's a you that didn't start with God, that is a separate duality which then God can give to you. That's not what's happening. It is an unfolding. It is an expansion from within out of that single-eyed vision of the limitless, numberless focuses of the presence of God that is continuing to revel and to make the very best gifts of life to every single part of life. So we've brought you tonight up to the very trembling lip of the cup, where all of this internal supra-fullness and supra-perfection and purity must, of necessity, give of itself, must come forth. And the highest and best of that which comes forth out of this presence are the sons of the presence, the daughters of the presence, the expressions of that presence that bear the stamp of the identity and the image of the presence that is their progenitors, that have the nobility impressed upon their brow, and every possible accoutrement of the trappings, not merely of aristocracy, not merely of royalty, but yes, we say it plainly, of divinity, for that is the divine nature of this God. And how could the members of that body be of a dissimilar nature to that which they are joined, that which they are rooted in the very presence that they are? In fact, they are the glory of that presence. They are the eternal Son. In this case, we spell it S-U-N, the Son of that presence, as a doorway, an open doorway each individualization is carved, it's etched out of this supreme oneness. And each one, as Jesus has said, I am the open door into this presence, into the one, into the good. I am the open door which none can ever shut.